I'm Brian Brandon. Today I want to talk with you about evidence for God and the spiritual life. So last time we spoke, we had a discussion on the mystery of happiness and why we really need the spiritual life and God in our lives to be complete and whole, and really to build on that quality of life, health, and wellness in the way we're built with a spirit, soul, and body. Today we're going to go a little bit further and discuss the evidence for God and for the spiritual life and for something that is not natural, it's supernatural in life. So first, I just want to ask you, why do you believe what you believe about God? What are the personal reasons behind? Have you ever really looked at evidence for the existence of God, for efficacy or the effectiveness, the impact of spirituality and religion, religious belief and practices on life? So there is a lot of evidence out there. People will say, well, you can't prove there's a God. And that's true. You absolutely cannot prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that there is a God. And at the same time, you can't disprove that there is a God either. What we can do is look at empirical evidence. And when you look at anything empirically, the fact is you can't even prove the existence of the person that is standing right in front of you. So there's the idea of proving anything other than mathematically is really a misnomer. What we have is we look at the empirical evidence and we gather evidence that would help us to make a reasonable conclusion, come to a reasonable conclusion about anything in life. So today let's talk about evidence for God, for the spiritual life, and for the supernatural. So like we've grown up in a culture that is kind of dismissive, sometimes ridicules, and I'm talking about the greater culture. The loudest voices tend to ridicule and put down the idea, the notion of a God, or of the relevance of spirituality or religion. Some are more accepting of the idea of spirituality in a generic, general sort of sense, but definitely many are dismissive of the importance of religion. And we've been brainwashed, I would say, by media, educational institutions, that's school and college, by social correctness, and a lot of other media and forces that have really denigrated the idea of spirituality and religion as a relevant and important force in our lives. So, since we can't prove or disprove anything, my question is, why is it such a threat? Why is this idea of God such a threat? And why not, at least in the scientific exploration of truth around God and these issues, why can't we at least have some scientific and intellectual integrity in our social institutions, and really at least being open to the idea that these things may exist? You may not find the evidence, but at least being open so that in our pursuit of truth and the scientific method, we're just not shutting down the possibility right out of the gate. Because your assumptions do, in the scientific method, your assumptions do lead you to conclusions. So let's talk about what evidence is there. And there's a lot of evidence, and I'm going to go through this fairly quickly. The first time I tried to do this, it took over an hour to talk through it. And I want to try to cut that in half today and make that a little more usable for everyone who's thinking about this. So the first point I will make is that there's a Dr. Lisa Miller who has written this book, The Spiritual Child, has done a lot of research on this. She is Jewish by faith, not real strong in her faith by her own admission, when she really kind of stumbled upon the science of spirituality. And her conclusion was based on a lot of experimentation in a sense that she did working with people as a psychologist and also with medical instrumentation, MRIs, etc. of the brain, that 1/3 of our spirituality is genetic. In other words, we are born a spiritual being. And that's what we were trying to say last time, is that we are not just a body and a soul, which the soul would be the mind, will, and emotions, but we also have this deep spiritual side of ourselves that we can't connect to as readily as we are in tune with our body and what's going on with our mind. She calls it an innate concrete faculty. So an innate, inner, concrete, very clearly present faculty. And she calls, her conclusion is that this is indisputable, so she would call it a fact, and that her discovery of this genetic aspect of human spirituality is rigorously scientific. It's not conjecture. It's not just wishing and hoping. A UCLA study, so that's Dr. Lisa Miller, a UCLA study concluded that human spirituality is a universal impulse and reality. Now, I want to quote the Bible here because there's probably a little known passage out of Ecclesiastes, chapter 3, verse 11, that says that God has set eternity in the hearts of people, but they cannot fathom it. And basically what Solomon, who wrote this passage, is saying is that there is this deep spiritual side of us that's in there that is really, it's mysterious. It's hard for us to connect to. And that's exactly what we realize in our experience of life. Doesn't mean we can't. We can wrap our heads around it. We can experience it, and we'll talk about that here. It's just that it's also easy to overlook. And that was the point of my first session when we talked about happiness, is that if you're constantly overlooking your spiritual dimension, this piece of you that wants to connect with God, your life is going to be limited in happiness, peace, and joy. So Miller showed scans of the brains and the effects of this, where spirituality happens in the brain in the same place that depression happens, which is very interesting. So if you think on a continuum, on one side you have spirituality, on the other side you have no spirituality. Depression and those mental health issues kind of grow in the absence of spirituality. The less spirituality you have in you're practicing and exercising, the more potential it is for those things to encroach upon your health, and vice versa. So very interesting, and she talks about that in a book that she's written called The Awakened Brain. There have been a number of studies. There's a very thick book that is edited by Koenig, McCullough, and Larson. It's called The Handbook of Religion and Health, and they basically show that there are hundreds of studies that demonstrate the positive effects of religious belief and practices in life. There's been a RAND study. It was commissioned by the military, who continues to include the spiritual dimension, the importance of spirituality in military members' wholeness, holistic health. So very interesting. And RAND confirmed a lot of that through the studies that they did that were commissioned by the military. Others, Young and Martin, concluded in some of their studies that spiritual fitness is linked to well-being, including and especially for those who've experienced great trauma. So we can find some healing through that spiritual religious life that can even help in the worst of traumas. Schultz and Pergament did a study of meditation, and they found that if you just focus on purely secular meditation, that it actually does not help, that you have a lower quality of life and a lower life satisfaction compared to if you have include your spirituality, your religious beliefs in that meditation. So great, important study as well. I watched a couple years ago, I don't know if you've seen this, but Secrets of the Blue Zone in Netflix, and they look at those who those areas of the world, pockets where people live to be centurions, so 100 years, and where these high percentages are of people who live in those areas. We know a lot of that has to do with what they eat and the exercise and activity they get, and socially how social they are. But there's also a religious factor in this as well. In fact, one of those episodes, they concluded that attending religious activities greater than one time a week can add 7 years to your life. Now that is pretty significant. Who wouldn't want to add 7 years to your life? And I want to put on top of that a quote by Dr. Miller out of her book that concludes, when we make full use of how we're built, our brains become structurally healthier and better connected, and we access unsurpassed psychological benefits, less depression, anxiety, and substance abuse, and more positive traits such as grit, resilience, optimism, tenacity, and creativity. And she is talking about tapping into the spiritual life. So some great conclusions there. When we look at and we've looked at studies here and some scientific inquiry into the spiritual life, and the point of all that is just to say the reason behind that, in my conclusion, is that that's because there's a God, because these are not just meaningless or even just mental exercises. This is the spiritual being of a person connecting with a God who exists, who's active and involved in our world and our lives, and how that shows up in the effectiveness of spirituality, religious beliefs, and practices in people's lives. So we could say, well, are there any bad studies? Well, yeah, there are some negative studies as well that deal especially with the perfectionistic and legalistic religion, and how that can be very negative and hurtful in people's lives. And if you've been involved in religion before in your life, maybe you've had some experiences where you've had some bad and unhealthy experiences, and those are out there as well. So we're talking here about a healthy activity in a healthy religious community, as opposed to some of these real controlling, almost cult-like kinds of communities, and also what you personally and sincerely believe and practice in your life, and how that really can make such a positive difference. There's other things that are out there scientifically as well. There's a number of scientists and physicists and astronomers who have ascribed to this thing called the anthropic principle. It's when they look at the idea of the Big Bang Theory, when they look at the idea of evolution, they recognize in all of this that life had to have a roadmap. In other words, there has to be a designer. There's a creator, a designer out there who's created a roadmap for life in what we see. And they come to that conclusion because there's these myriad of quote unquote coincidental factors that have contributed to how life came about on Earth that are just beyond random. They can't be random. Things like water, things like neutrons, protons, and electrons, and how they're interconnected and how their energy works. And there's just so much of this stuff that's so deep that it's just can't be random. And so this is the conclusion, again, of many people who are looking at what science says about where we come from and how we got to where we are today. Even Darwin said things that are irreducible cannot evolve. That there has to be some kind of creator, designer for these things. And you just think, well, what is that? You think of something like the eye, where at what point do you have an eye like our human eye? And can it evolve? How does how does the eye really evolve? There's so much complexity to it. And when we think about that, we usually think things are are less complexity grow to higher complexity in evolution, and we see things like, these ancient, what are called, these creatures that are supposedly here for hundreds of millions of years and are just very low on the complexity scale, and yet they show great complexity in some of the aspects of and characteristics of what they are. And so, we can look at a creature that supposedly has been around for hundreds of millions of years that had an eye that is as complex as a modern day dragonfly, which can see 360 degrees. We can't even replicate it. And yet in these fossilized creatures, we see a very similar kind of eye. So questions: do we really fully understand this evolutionary process and really the evidence for the evolutionary process, or have we just made some assumptions and some conclusions? Because these are not facts. These are scientific theories that have to be justified and have to be proven by empirical evidence. Just like you would say, well, what is the evidence for God creating everything that is? And we would look and examine, what evidence is there. In the same way, the idea that this all happened naturally and it evolved through processes, what is the real empirical evidence for that? We don't have these fossils that show a transitory states between different kinds of creatures. We should see that in the fossil record, but it's absent. And even things that have been posited as being part of the fossil record that show that, many of them, many have proved to be they're false. They're not what they were originally conjectured that they were. And so the missing link, the search for the missing link is still alive and well out there because we haven't discovered it. And yet at the same time, there are those out there, like, when you grow up in our modern school systems that say, well, this, the theory of evolution is really the fact, it's factual, and we have so much evidence. And then when you really dig into the evidence, we find out there's a lot more assumptions behind the theory than there is actual evidence behind the theory that leads us to the conclusion that this all happened through natural processes. So the debate continues on that. And I think, as we look at that debate, no matter how young or old we are, we need to be highly suspicious and cautious about coming to conclusions about, how old the earth really is and how long life has really existed, and how all of this actually evolved, because there's no ability to scientifically recreate in a lab these kinds of processes and these kinds of timelines and this kind of development of life that so many people, just posit as fact. It's just has not happened. So we need to be cautiously skeptical and really look at all the evidence and what does the current evidence we have show us. And that's what we've been talking about. So we see there's some scientific inquiry into all these things. There have been for decades, but some of this evidence we've already talked about is pretty compelling. And there's testimonies of those who died and came back. There have been several books that have been written about these kinds of things, where people have we would say an afterlife experience. They have a death experience where they're resuscitated and then come back to life. And near universally, they talk about something after this life. So we see you really don't die until your spirit dies. And when that spirit comes back, then you're not dead. Now, you can be brain dead, your body can be dying, and you can still be very cognizant in your brain, but there's still this third part of us. And when people who've died and then they've come back to life describe it, they often talk about going to the light or seeing light or having some kind of vision or experience with heaven or angels or some kind of spiritual beings. I remember listening to a gentleman. He had fallen and hit his head on concrete, and he died. And he said he went to heaven, and he shared the beauty and the brightness of the colors and the sense of peace and how beautiful the music of heaven was, and that he was able to communicate with God and with others there without even speaking. It was like a telepathic experience of speaking, communicating with those around him. And then he ended up being resuscitated and came back to life. And he used to be very vocal telling this story, I think right up until his final death, sharing. And we've seen some movies about this, and there's been other conjecture. But I've been with people who have passed away and at the time of their death, and I've heard others share about that as well. And you kind of get this sense of a transitioning to the afterlife, that this is more than just what happens when an animal dies. And unfortunately, growing up on a small farm, you see life and death in the animal world, and it's a very different experience for an animal versus a human. And I think that's because of this spiritual side of us and the spiritual life. Around the world, there is a strong belief in God and heaven and the afterlife. Atheism is really a concept that grows from the outside in. It doesn't grow from the inside out. It's more of a privileged concept to most people in the world who live life very differently, who don't have basic necessities guaranteed. They can't just go to the supermarket, get everything they need, come home, sit down, relax, watch TV. They're very much more engaged in their providing for the basic needs that they have and for their family. To those people, religion, spirituality is just core. It is the central part of their culture and of their community identity. And they also tend to live much more community-minded lifestyles as opposed to and value. They have a community-minded value system, like a family and extended community value system, much more than the individualistic value system that we have in our country and in the Western world. So when you look across the world, there's a large amount of belief. And even when you look at how things happened in this earth, there's a lot of spiritually rooted explanations for things. And I'm not saying those are all accurate. I'm just saying what I would say is the idea that you have this spiritual consciousness in humanity that has to be expressed is in itself proof that there is this eternity in our hearts. There is this spiritual side of our life that we don't fully fathom. Nobody has it all figured out. We have religious systems, beliefs, spiritual beliefs, we have practices, and we're connecting with God in various ways, but we don't have it all figured out. And that's why I really look toward the teachings of Jesus and his life and model and standard in my own personal life as I seek this, because I have seen personally the change that has brought in my life, in my family's life, and in the lives of other people around me. And that has been over multiple decades. So when I was very young, my parents had a pretty radical conversion to Christ. And I come from, I mentioned last time, my grandfather was a mean alcoholic, that front row seat to addiction really colored my whole family, unfortunately, but it really imprinted itself on my life and on my father's life. And I'm convinced I would be an alcoholic today or a drug addict had it not been for the change that religion brought to my life and my parents' life first. And so I saw my parents, the trajectory of their lives change radically. They weren't perfect people, and my father being a child of a mean alcoholic and then being a parent, as you have that example. It wasn't a perfect childhood by any stretch of the imagination, but the trajectory changed, and it would have been a very different thing had my father continued in alcoholism, I'm sure. And so over the course of my life at a young age, that affected my life, and I had an experience with God that has really changed the course of my life. And again, it hasn't made my life perfect. It hasn't made me the perfect parent or the perfect person, but certainly changed the trajectory of my life. When I was about 9 years old, 10 years old, I was walking down the road, and there was a car coming the other way, and we were going sledding. So there was we were just dragging our sleds on the road, heading to the hill where we were going to sled ride. And this car just kind of came around a corner. It was going real fast on this country road, and it was headed right toward us. When it came around, it beeped its horn, which kind of startled us. It all kind of happened fairly quickly. My friend was a little bit older than me. He went to the right, which is where I should have gone, but I went to the left. And when I got safely off the road, I kind of thought in my mind, well, my friend, he's older than me. He's on the safe side. I should be over there with him. So I headed to the other side of the road, which was a big mistake, right? Should have stayed where I was. But I headed to the other side of the road, and the car never slowed down. When I got out there in the middle of the road, about 2/3 across, but still real close to that middle line, just over the middle line, I'd had this like wake up call that said, hey, you were safer where you were. You should have stayed over there. And I wheeled and turned to go back the direction that I was going to go. And at that point, I felt a hand on my chest, physically touch my chest. Now, there was no hand there. My friend was still on the other side of the road, safe on the other side. But I felt this hand on my chest, and as I turned to step, that hand kept me from moving. I wasn't able to step and try to go back, and in that next instant, like half a second, that little car never slowed down, went speeding by, and it beeped its horn, which scared me worse. But thankfully, that hand protected me from becoming a hit and run. And a voice spoke in my mind at that point, and it said, you're not gonna die until I'm finished. My work, my purpose for your life is finished. And that's been something that's been very comforting through several, harrowing experiences and even life-threatening experiences, that I've always had that kind of in the back of my mind, that voice and that message. When I was a little bit later, I was in 5th grade, our house burned down in the middle of the night, and we just miraculously, my mother happened to be awake, and we jumped to safety from the 2nd floor of our house, or we would have perished in that fire. So there was another time when my brother and I were caught in a riptide, and we would have been seriously injured or killed had it not just been for what I consider a miraculous intervention in that, and we both were saved. So there were 3 times that I look at where just those easy ones as a child, and there have been others since then where you look and you go, wow, I could have been killed kinds of experiences, which I've had others of those. But those were just 3 from when I was a child. And then when I was 15 years old, I had I'd come home from church. Our pastor had taught on this verse out of Ephesians 6 where there's angels and demons, and there's principalities and powers. Our battle is not with flesh and blood, but it's with these evil spiritual forces. And I remember reading that passage in my Bible when I got home, and I was ready to go to sleep, and I shut my Bible, turned off my light, and I laid back in my bed. And in that instant that I laid back in my bed, I mean, this was seconds after I shut off the light, I saw this head, this face in my window at the other end of my room, and it was probably about 13, 14 feet away. And it laughed at me and said, "You doubt." And it laughed and said, "You doubted me." And instantly my room filled with these dark shapes. So much so, it filled so that the whole space of my room was filled. And I didn't even want to breathe. I was holding my breath because I didn't want to touch these shapes, and they were pressing down on me. And as soon as that room was filled, I saw a vision, like my sight was opened again, and there were 4 angels at the points, 4 corners of my bedposts, and there was a white protective shield that was protecting me from any of these dark shapes touching me. And as soon as I saw that, it was all gone. And I laid there probably for like 10 minutes at least without moving, because I was afraid that I might move and break through the shield and I might touch some of these shapes and creatures. But I actually had a vision of angels and demons that just made a huge impact on me, and I haven't doubted that one since. So I've had these experiences, and this is my story, right? So these are not, and everybody has their own story, and these are things that I look at. These are reasons why I believe in God, and why I believe that your spiritual beliefs and practices matter, and why I believe connection with God is so important. Is the reality of these things has touched my life in a tangible way. Now, I've never heard God speak to me audibly. I have a friend who had God speak to them audibly. I've never heard God speak that way to me in my life. But so other people have different experiences, and maybe you feel like, well, I haven't had any cool experiences like that. Doesn't mean that you don't wrestle with, where is God in the midst of my struggle, my adversity. My book is all about spiritual resiliency, harnessing the power of the spiritual life to overcome adversity. So, it's still a struggle. It's still been a struggle. Those things aren't a silver bullet, having those kinds of experiences, but they are formative. They are helpful. They inform what you think and believe, and they certainly have for me. I've experienced God's presence so powerfully. I mean, it's just like the best feeling I've ever had in my life. And you just want to stay just in that spot. You just want to stay there forever. And I think that's what heaven is going to be like. When I think of things like this, I think, what would my life be like without God? I would be dead. And if I was still alive, I'm sure I would be an addict of some kind without God. What would your life be like without God? I think there's, I had a sign that said, "Coincidence is when God decides to remain anonymous." But, there's so many things we don't even know happened that God protected us from. And you think about, how much have I been protected from in this life, in this world, that I'm not even aware of, that somehow angels or God was involved in. What about these coincidences in your life? How is that impacted? So when you think about, the spiritual life and this connection with God, and you think about the existence of God, where would this world really be without God? And you can say, well, geez, this world's a wreck. If this is the world God created, how can it be like that? And there is a session, it's not today, that I'm going to talk about why this world is the way it is, but it's not the world that God created. This world isn't the way it is because God made it this way. The world is the way it is because we've made it this way. And we will look at that and in detail and talk about, God as a force of goodness in the world and in humanity versus other forces that have really warped and twisted what we know today. Even the idea of survival of the fittest is not a God. That's not the way God created this world. So we'll talk about that in a future session. But there's also, so I'm talking about my experiences. There's a lot of other people's experiences we could talk about too. I've talked with someone recently who shared how God saved them. They were going to be aborted, and not at their mother's wish, that the doctor took it upon themselves. This is back in the late 60s, early 70s. Single mom, doc took it upon themselves to help the single mom out and perform an abortion. And the mom was literally praying that God would keep her baby alive, and this gentleman was that baby, and he miraculously survived a forced compulsory abortion. My aunt a few years ago was diagnosed with lymphoma, had all these lumps. Hospice came in. They were just trying to keep her free of pain until she died. And she cried out to God. And I really never knew my aunt as a very religious person, honestly. But she cried out to God and just prayed that this pain would be taken away. And she had instantly had a vision of Jesus, and he turned and smiled at her, and the pain went away instantly. She didn't need to take any more pain medication for this lymphoma. The pain was immediately gone. She's still here, still alive and well. And over the last few years, these like tumors and stuff that she had in her body all over from the lymphoma have started to disappear. So she is just a walking miracle of God's healing power. And again, this is a story I'm telling you that is my aunt's story. And, when you hear stories like this, one of the questions, sometimes you kind of cynically ask is, well, why didn't God do that for me or do that for my aunt? Or, I don't have the crystal ball to answer all these questions. I just know that the best life we can have, given the circumstances, challenges, struggles that we're going to face in life, whether it's addiction or whether it's a health issue or whatever it is, the best life we can have is with God, not apart from him. He's not the enemy. He is the helper. I have a lot of people that I've talked with over the years, and they say, well, church is my church is nature. I really see, the divine is out there and in nature. And, that's exactly what's said in Romans chapter 1, verse 21 in the Bible. It says God's invisible qualities and his divine power can be seen from what has been made. In other words, yeah, you go out there and you look at, I got a beautiful sunsets almost every night at our house, and I try to be there to watch them. It's almost like a spiritual experience to watch the beautiful sunsets. We get to look out over a lake, and we're surrounded by these trees in the woods, and it's just spiritual. I don't know what else to say, is I just thank God for the beauty of all of this and what he's created, and being able to have a front row seat to it every day. And we all have a front row seat to it every day, whether it's in the people we look at and we see the awesomeness of God, what God's created in other people, or whether it's animals or it's nature or it's a mountain or the stars and the moon, and just the ocean. These things are moving, and they're moving because there's a creator that is visible behind it all. Again, another reason I think that we can conclude there is a God is there's a lot of stories out there of how God's touched people's lives. There's our own stories. There's other people's stories. You can look out your window. You can look at nature, creation, and you can see God at work. And we could go on about many things, and there's so much more we could say, and a lot more I could get into detail, but not if I'm going to keep it around 40 minutes, which is where we're at now, and not hours, because we would want to dissect this and really dig in and show the proofs and show the accuracy of what I'm saying. But what I'm trying to do is provoke you to take a second look and say what really is the evidence, because there's a lot more out there than what we're taught and what we normally hear. It's not something that is on the front page of the paper or the news or on social media. These are things that often, get ridiculed and put down and get subjected to a lot of unfair criticism without really giving them the credit for the validity that they have. So the last thing I would say here before I conclude is just when you look at our world, the reality of the world we live in, despite all these technical advances, despite the internet, and life is so much easier than it was 50, 100 years ago, and yet we have this diminishing sense of well-being by people around the world. And I think the truth there is that the spiritual life provides things that technology and money can't buy, things like peace and contentedness, purpose and meaning, connectedness, harmony. There's so many verses in the Bible that talk about quote unquote one another. Be good to one another. So many different things. Be kind, be forgiving, be considerate, be hospitable. There's just so many ways. Be respectful of one another. There's just so many things that are in there that if we just did that one thing of just treating people the way we wanted to be treated, how different really this world would be. If everybody in this world just did that one thing, wow, what a difference there would be. So my conclusion is that there's a lot of evidence out there. When we talk about faith, we're not talking about a blind faith that just blindly believes stuff that is just completely absurd. We're talking about a faith that is based upon substance, and it's based upon things that we can see here that show that there is a God and that the spiritual life is actually very critically important to our health, wholeness, well-being, to our social connectedness, and our ability to thrive in life. So that's where I want to leave you for today. Again, thank you for tuning in. We'll continue next week when we start looking at spiritual disciplines and how different spiritual practices can really help and make us whole and strong. But for today, have a wonderful day, and God bless you.